tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Namatu acharyasa. Patience. It was not easy for the Westerners to adapt to life at Wat Pah Pong. Not only were they faced with all the innate, fundamental challenges of an ascetic life, but these were compounded by the need to learn a new language and adapt to a new culture. Physically, it could be brutal. The heat of the hot season, combined with the energy-sapping humidity, made for a particularly enervating climate. Many of the foreign monks developed gastric disorders, especially those whose diet had formerly consisted of highly refined foods. They found sticky rice heavy and hard to digest. But with only one meal a day, they had little choice but to eat a large ball of it. The alternative was losing a lot of weight, and indeed, many of the monks became so thin their ribs protruded alarmingly. Most of those who stayed on became seriously ill at least once. Malaria, scrub typhus, and amoebic dysentery were a constant threat. Luang Por told them to patiently endure. When Ajahn Brahmavamsa was hospitalized with a high fever, Luang Por visited him and encouraged him with words that were as far from mollycoddling as could be imagined. He told the young monk to reflect that there were only two outcomes to his illness. Either he'd get better or he wouldn't. He should be at peace with both possibilities. On one occasion, Venerable Sunyo told Luang Por that he felt that since becoming a monk, his hardships and suffering had increased rather than decreased. Luang Por replied, "I know that some of you have had a background of material comfort and outward freedom. By comparison, now you live an austere existence. Then, in the practice, I often make you sit and wait for long hours. Food and climate are different from your home. But everyone must go through some of this. This is the suffering that leads to the end of suffering. This is how you learn. When you get angry and feel sorry for yourself, it is a great opportunity to understand the mind. The Buddha called defilements our teachers." On such occasions, Luang Por would conclude with his keynote teachings: patience and right view. You must be patient. Patience and endurance are essential to our practice. When I was a young monk, I didn't have it as hard as you. I knew the language and was eating my native food. Even so, some days I despaired. I thought about disrobing or even killing myself. This kind of suffering comes from wrong views. However, once you have seen the truth, you become free from views and opinions. Everything becomes peaceful. On another occasion, after reminding the monks that, quote, patience is the heart of Dhamma practice, the root virtue of practitioners, unquote, Luang Por observed that, as few people would freely choose to practice patience, the Westerners could be said to have one advantage. It was much harder for them to run away than the Thais. He said, "The thought of going all the way home is daunting, and so you've been able to put up with it so far." But it wasn't enough for them to simply grit their teeth. They needed to see the purpose of exercising patience. He was not advocating asceticism for its own sake. Things here run counter to your old habits. You eat out of your bowl, with the curries and sweets all put in together. Who could like doing that? If you've still got any defilements left, then they will be continually thwarted. Food of different kinds gets mixed together in your bowl. How does that feel? Do you see any defilement arising in your mind? Have a look. This way of eating is niggling and frustrating. That's how it's meant to be. The training is a wearing away of defilements. Even if the effort to awaken sati is not always successful, you can at least oppose defilement. That's how the training has to be. Sadly, the intellectual defilements of the Western monks did not entail a compensatory deficit in the earthier afflictions, and they were not spared Luang Por's methods intended to torment the defilements. The rationale was explained to them on many occasions. Defilements could be most clearly revealed as defilements, the cause of suffering and not self, when they were steadfastly opposed. Looking at what happened when one was separated from the light and united with the dislight provided a simple shortcut to understanding the nature of the mind. As this path of opposing desire was one that few people, even dedicated monastics, could follow consistently in a balanced, constructive way on their own, it was embedded in the heart of the training at Wat Pah Pong. For some, the need to constantly go against old habits could be overwhelming. One English postulant famously exclaimed loudly in a broad northern accent, "This going against the stream, it's not a babbling brook we're talking about here, it's whitewater." One of the monks who felt the brunt of this style of teachings was Venerable Waropanyo. His well-known craving for ice drinks, a cause of much teasing, meant that he was seldom given the chance to indulge it. There's a quote, "When I went to Luang Por's kuti, it was as though he didn't even see me. If there was ice or a drink for the monks, he would wait until I left before passing it out." Years later, he recounted these episodes, saying that he felt for me, but that he knew he had to give me a hard time for my own benefit. Now you see the value in such treatment, don't you? I did. He often said jokingly to me and to the Sangha, I would be afraid to go to America because Waropanyo would probably want to get me back for torturing him. And it was Waropanyo when Luang Por did come to America. It was Paul went and helped out, and that was where he was telling Paul, say, yeah, I was, I really felt for you at the time. And it was during that time when Luang Por was here in America. Venerable Waropanyo also recalled an occasion when a visiting monk received similar treatment. Just before the Rains retreat, a newly ordained American showed up. He was just out of the Peace Corps and was planning to stay in robes for a few months before going back home. He wanted to stay at Wat Pah Pong for the retreat, but Luang Por refused. It had nothing to do with the monk personally. Rather, it was the fact that Luang Por wanted to put new people through a probationary period, which couldn't be done during the retreat, and that he sometimes was not so keen on people who weren't seriously committed, but were just dabbling in monkhood. So the monk stayed a few days and prepared to leave, somewhat disappointed. One night before he left, Luang Por came to the Dhamma hall to give a talk. After chanting was done, he spoke for an hour with a layman who had come. Then he began his Dhamma talk. He went on and on and on. After a couple of hours, it was obvious he was playing with us. One new monk was foolish enough to ask a question, and he gave a very long answer. Then he asked, "Does anyone have any more questions?" Nobody stirred. I thought, maybe he will let us go now. But he said, "Well, maybe you were uncertain about that," and went into more explanation. It seemed that he covered everything in the entire Buddhist canon. Meanwhile, the Peace Corps monk, who had been sitting directly in front of him, was squirming around, changing sitting positions, holding his drawn-up knees, that's definitely not to be done, and glaring angrily at Luang Por. Finally, at 1:15 a.m., Luang Por looked at the clock and innocently said, "What time is it? Oh, I guess it's time to adjourn." Perhaps I should mention that we never sat comfortably in chairs, but flat on the floor, and at Wat Pah Pong, the floors were concrete or marbly granite. We couldn't stretch our legs out or put our knees up in front of us or use a cushion. If you're accustomed to sitting on chairs, try it for 2 or 3 hours and you'll appreciate what it was like. If you're accustomed to sitting on the floor, try 4 or 5 hours on a hard floor with no cushion. The next day, the Peace Corps monk came to me to complain. He shouldn't have done that. What a waste of time. That's the extreme of self-mortification. The Buddha's middle way means avoiding the extremes of sensual indulgence and self-mortification. That afternoon, Luang Por asked me if the new monk liked his talk the night before. I told him what he had said. He laughed and said, I was observing him. I knew he was angry. Now he won't feel bad about not being able to stay here. Luang Por himself seemed to have an endless store of patience with his quote-unquote high-maintenance Western disciples. Ajahn Chah recounts, "I remember him listening attentively as I labored to explain some of the difficulties I'd been having, and then grinning and pointing to himself and saying, 'Me too,' and that was it. And he was amazingly tolerant. Really, with so many monks and a few really awkward ones, like me, whose language he couldn't speak, it must have been an awful lot to put up with. But he never seemed to mind, except on one occasion when something went badly wrong. And then it was as if a jolly, happy old frog suddenly metamorphosed into the most terrifying species of monk-eating tiger you can imagine. He didn't mess about. I like that." Work projects. In the end, it was the Western monks' belief in Luang Por's wisdom and compassion that allowed them to give themselves to the training. He pushed them out of their comfort zone. He showed them that they could do far more than they thought they could, endure things that, alone, they would never have endured. Work projects were one good example. Every now and again, there would be an intense period of hard physical labor, usually a building project, and the daily routine would be transformed. Morning chanting at 3, a 1 or 2 hour alms round at dawn, meal at 8, these were sacrosanct. But after the daily meal was over, there might be a string of days when the monks would become cement mixers and laborers from mid-morning until after dark. Working long hours in temperatures exceeding 30 degrees and humidity above 90%, that's in centigrade, fueled by 1 meal a day and 4 or 5 hours of sleep, stretched them to the limits. The construction of the new Uposatha Hall was one of the last major projects that Luang Por was to oversee. The Uposatha Hall is usually the most beautiful and ornate building in a monastery. Often, many years have passed before a newly established monastery has sufficient funds to build such a hall. This was the case at Wat Pah Pong. From its inception, Patimokkha recitations took place in a small, nondescript building behind the dining hall. Only in 1977 did work begin on the erection of an imposing Uposatha Hall, designed by an architect disciple of Luang Por in an unorthodox modern style. The building was to be situated to the west of the Dhamma hall on a raised platform of earth some 3 meters high. The earth for this base was brought in by truck, but with no machinery available, the task of moving it into place and pounding it solid fell to the monastics. It was grueling work, accomplished with wheelbarrows, bamboo baskets, and wooden pounders. The monks would begin at 9 in the morning and finish by the light of kerosene lanterns at 9 or 10 at night. Most of the Thais, being from farming backgrounds, were not unused to this type of work in these kinds of conditions. But for the Westerners, predominantly from urban, middle-class backgrounds, it was a harsh test of endurance. Worse, perhaps, than the physical ordeal was the mental resistance. One monk said, "The choice was to do it in a grudging way, longing to be away from all the activity and exhaustion, back in your kuti meditating, or just give yourself to the work. It made more sense to say to yourself, Luang Por is my teacher, and he wants me to do this. He's not asking me to do anything wrong, just something I don't want to do. Why make myself miserable with wanting something I can't have right now?" Also, I'd noticed that if I did think wistfully about being away somewhere doing formal meditation, the meditations I imagined I'd be having were always more peaceful than the real ones I was actually having at that time. The presence of Luang Por put others' minds at rest. One monk said, "Just catching sight of Luang Por walking around looking so solid, so unshakable, I would be filled with this absolute certainty that he knew exactly what he was doing. If this project was all right by him, I'd think it's certainly good enough for me." With the conclusion of the work on the mound, Luang Por left for a few days, and an almost farcical period of earth-shifting ensued. The acting abbot decided that the leftover earth, which had just been laboriously shifted to a discrete location, would be better placed at a different spot. The monks were asked to return to work in order to shift the earth for a second time, a job requiring some 3 days' hard work. On Luang Por's return, however, he declared his preference for the original location, and the earth had to be carried wheelbarrow by wheelbarrow, basket by basket, back to the original spot. Some of the Western monks remembered having read about the trials of the Tibetan yogi Milarepa, and now felt that they had a better idea of what had been involved. Nevertheless, the value of this kind of interlude was not lost on the monks involved. Another monk commented, "Luang Por was always creating situations where we'd have to face up to our old ingrained habits, particularly the ones in which we created suffering for ourselves by wanting things to be other than the way they were. He helped us to see our craving, and in everyday situations, how it fed our discontent, how we lied to ourselves." Ajahn Brahmavamsa summarized, "It taught me to look for the cause of suffering, not in the externals, but in me, in my attitude, in my craving, in my attachment, in my delusions. And that if you cannot work and be peaceful, if you cannot move earth all day and be at peace with it, you'll never be freed from suffering." I'll leave it there. It goes into another section.
Sadhu, 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 anumodam.
Questions?
There was a quote early on from Luang Por about the Buddha saying that defilements are our teachers.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, I'm wondering what he's referring to. Maybe it's not a concept that I'm familiar with what I've read about what the Buddha said.
This is the forest Dhamma and scriptural. Remember what Ajahn Chah is pointing to is being able to sort of look at defilements and learn from it, rather than experience defilements and follow them, experience defilements and run away from them, experience defilements and complicate them, but to actually learn from them.
The sort of strategy of the teacher, torturing the defilements of the students. I mean, it sounds like, for just thinking about, like, for myself, I mean, it probably would take somebody, like, Luang Por Chah is probably like a very charismatic, a very like, it takes a very special kind of teacher to be able to do that to your students. Is that
Yeah, it takes somebody like Ajahn Chah to be able to do that, or some of these great teachers, and it also takes a situation that again, as I said, especially for us Westerners, it was really helpful to be, 8,000 miles from home, and with no resources to do anything other than, okay, I'll stick it out a bit longer, and but then how much you learn from that is really amazing.
One part. There was one part, I think it was a quote, it might have been from Paul Breiter, and it was saying that Luang Por Chah, he's most of the time so jovial and just really warm and everything like that. And but there was one, it sounded like he said there was one time, maybe he was saying there were times, but it sounded like there was one specific instance where he turned into like a species of monk-eating tiger.
Yeah.
And it sounded like it was referring to a specific incident, and I just was wondering if that's the case.
Well, it was a specific incident that he himself experienced. No, that was actually, that quote was from Ajahn Chah.
Oh, I see.
And generally Ajahn Chah was quite warm and jovial, but all of us experienced him in ways when he became very ferocious, and I remember one time, let me say, Luang Por Chah really dressing down a particular monk, who, Vietnam vet, Silver Star, not that's award for bravery, very high award for bravery, and also very large, probably well over a foot taller than Luang Por Chah, and Luang Por Chah just laying into him, was just undaunted by that, and that particular monk being, not just taken aback, but brought to tears by the ferocity of it. So it's Luang Por was fearless, and so that well, you didn't see that come out that often, but he didn't. If he thought it was necessary, he wasn't going to back down.
Did you see a lot of people really benefit from this kind of treatment? It seems like some people might run away,
Oh yeah, oh sure. It doesn't mean that he was always sort of right, but mostly, and definitely did see people benefit. And that particular monk still is you just say the word Luang Por Chah and he melts. Yeah. Melts with warmth and sense of respect, as opposed to that. He really felt that it was worthwhile.
You say that sometimes he was wrong.
Well, I didn't know wrong, but it didn't work. So it doesn't. So that and that's from our perspective. I don't quite know what he was, but didn't seem to have the desired effect. What I'm saying is, it wasn't infallible.
They were just like run away or something. They were just run away, or just like have be like a wall.
Yeah.
It could be that nothing will work. It could be with some people nothing will work.
Yeah, and it's sort of like a last-ditch effort of compassion, and
It's like the Buddha had his own detractors. It wasn't like the Buddha could get everybody.
This is true. Yeah. Even the Buddha couldn't get through to some people.
Luang Por, have you found I'm sure your own teaching style has evolved and changed over the decades with more experience and maturity, but did you find yourself more of a disciplinarian when you were younger in Thailand, or is it?
Yes.
Yeah. I don't live here 12 months a year, so I'm sure you can be maybe a tiger at times. I'm not sure, but what's your personal attitude? As an outsider, I'll ask that question. And the monks can benefit from your response.
Well, I'm a lot more laid back than I was before, and also just more sensitive to where people are, what might be useful. Or I like to think that anyway. So that, but certainly, I've, there's some stories around. Ajahn Pasanno.
Ajahn Chah, when he was here, he gave a talk, might be in the archives. He talked about Luang Por in the earlier days.
I've also heard some more recent stories as well.
I've heard you say that one of the reasons why you came to the West, was you found that you couldn't teach how you wanted to teach in Thailand or at Nanachat. Would you be willing to expand on it?
Well, I mean, part of it is in the sense of I found it very difficult to just. I mean, there's many layers to why I left Thailand, but I found it difficult to really establish a coherent sense of community at Wat Nanachat. There just seemed to be so many options for people to go to so many places that people didn't stay long enough to be able to develop that strong, coherent sense of community. So that was a part of it, and then with that, being able to maybe lead people through a more complete or to be an example for how people can use the holy life to really live and practice and gain the fruits of that. It's hard when people are so the community is very, very fluid. Also, just the sense of, like, in Thailand, there was just the amount of time that I had to be giving to a whole variety of different aspects of the monastic life. one is teaching and training the monastic community, but then there's the lay community, and then there's the expectations and helping, which I was always ready to do, but helping much of the broader Sangha, both in terms of the Wat Pah Pong Sangha as well as the administrative Sangha, so that it's just increasingly more and more well known and being drawn upon to take on duties, which I could do, but it spread myself thin for being with the actual community as well. So I felt if I was in the West, I could be able to give more time to, just by being here, even if I'm not making myself overtly, I'm not off somewhere else.
And it sounds like the co-abbotship with Ajahn Chah may have been particularly helpful in that case, because he could take on many of the duties that you were just describing.
Yeah.
Well, it seems that you and Luang Por Pasanno both, at some point, quite, I suppose in some ways quite early in your monastic careers, made a very conscious decision to be to sacrifice for the sake of the Sangha. In terms of Luang Por Pasanno, after 5 vasas, going and sort of giving himself to Luang Por Chah and accepting all these responsibilities. And I know that for almost all of your monastic life, you've been an abbot in some respect, except for maybe two periods of retreat for a year or something, like not. So what are your reflections on that? I know that a lot of monks haven't taken that route, and I'm just curious about your thoughts.
Well, on a certain level, it was a bit beyond my control. Luang Por called me back, asked me to be the abbot of Wat Nana Chat, and then he went and got sick. So I could have probably run a bit, but Sir Luang Por was still there, and just felt it was more appropriate to be to stick with it, and I wanted to be close to Luang Por as well, and even if he was ill or wasn't actively teaching, his presence was very, very palpable to me anyway.
Luang Por, I was wondering, you mentioned that one of the challenges is the community dynamics of kind of people staying long enough to form a community, and the other dynamics around that in Thailand and at Wat Pah Pong. Is that just like kind of a feature of Thai monasteries in general, or was that something more particular to Wat Pah Pong, or is it?
To a certain degree, it's. I mean, there is an element of that in Thailand, but then for Thai, generally a Thai sensibility has a much stronger, say, even if they're more the sense of both communal harmony and devotion to training or teacher or place is very strong. And for us, that's not the same feeling. So then, it would, and so often it was that even if you were there, then you're still sort of, oftentimes you're making your plans of where you're going to go next. So it was hard to and to a certain degree, that's something that all of the abbots of what Nanachat have struggled with.
Also, just thinking, like, do you think that the overall, like, has the overall character of the Westerners seeking ordination changed over the years? Like maybe when you took over the abbotship of Wat Pah Nanachat, like, it was probably harder to find and harder to get to than maybe today, or a place like Abhayagiri, which is...
Yeah, I mean, people actually know something about Buddhism now. No, it's really, actually had a meditation practice before they came to the monasteries, which is, not the case, especially, say, like in my day, and then even when I was early years of being the abbot, then the access to information was much more limited. So nowadays, there's a much more mature and genuinely interested. Okay.